My father was a veteran of the Lincoln Brigade in the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. His belief was that he was very his life teaching to me was that if the International Brigade had beaten Franco, the Second World War possibly wouldn't have happened. And when you discuss war, people think that soldiers are burly fighting men, but my recollection always of my father was a kind gentleman with great beliefs and would have strong beliefs in different things, but would understand other people's belief. He was an atheist, my mother was a Catholic, and he never put her down, or he might have passed comments on some of the church's teachings, but he never made her feel uncomfortable. And when we were growing up, being reared as Catholics, he never interfered with that. Very gentle and loyal man, loyal to his political beliefs all his life. When he came home from Spain, he was walking along the street one day and he met a friend that he had been great friends with, and he crossed to the other side of the road when he saw my father. And Dad often said he must have seen two horns coming up out of his head, and that was because the propaganda at the time from the blue shirts and from the pulpit, the church, was that in between battles and in between fighting, the International Brigaders were going to graveyards and pulling up the bodies of nuns and priests, which was completely huge propaganda. Dad said there was priests in the International Brigade, there was nuns as nurses and helping out, and also when he came home, they were shunned because of the propaganda of the Catholic Church. When my father returned from the Spanish Civil War, he got a job for the Royal Ivor Insurance Company, and on the strength of, I think it was 3 and 6pence a week, he asked my mother to marry him. And as I said, my mother was from a Reddenite family, and Dad's two brothers were incarcerated in the jail up in Ballybricken for being members of the IRA, and my mother used to play with the jailer's daughter inside. So my father reckons that when he was waving in at his brother, because he was the youngest in the family, my mother could have been heading in to play
opposite sides
of the track with the jailer's daughter. They eloped, got married at 6 o'clock, and they had
in the morning
and eloped. My grandmother and my grandfather weren't at the wedding because it's just one of those things.
But your aunt always reckoned that your grandmother got rid of them all cheap.
Yeah, she covered it with a rope, so that's why she pretended that she didn't like him, so she didn't have to pay for any weddings.
It's quite possible.
And my dad was working, and his cousin had a house in John Street where Dignity was, and they opened a little shop there. Mam ran the little shop for years, the Beehive, just sweet shop. And even though, my father, Dad with the church, as I said, my mother was a Catholic, and Dad with the church, as I said, he never condemned Mam or never said no, they just lived their own life and were happily married for 60 years. But my father's stories of what influenced him against the church was the propaganda that was going on throughout in Ireland about the international brigades, the boys who went from Ireland. And when he came home, one of his comrades had died on the battlefield, and he went to see his mum to say that a priest had attended him and knew that would be great comfort for him. And he went to the church and stood at the back of the church, and he saw the lady going up to receive communion, and the priest passed her off on the altar. And my father said he'll always remember, he could hear the sigh, her breaths just stopped, and she slowly turned and walked down with her head hanging down the church. And I mean, that must have been an awful feeling for the woman. And also my mother and father, it took them 17 years to have their first child. My brother and I were both born in Dublin because it was the first gynecologist, and they were extremely grateful after that length of time to have one child. And what also put my father off was because when my mother came home, she had to go and be churched. Not many people would remember that. A woman had to go and kneel or prostrate herself down and be cleansed by the priest, and be cleansed because she had had a baby. Well, how she got to have the baby, I suppose, was it. And that
outside of wedlock, sorry, or
no. Mum and Dad were married 17 years.
That was normal up
before
to
they had their first child. Waterford.
Oh, you're married yet to do this?
Oh yeah, this was nothing to do. No, this was married women had to be. I think it was church.
Church is the word, yeah.
Yeah, you could check that out. That's true though.
Well, it's true, yeah.
They had to go and be churched to be cleansed by the priest. Those days, babies were christened in the hospital. We were baptised in the hospital. But no, they were married. They were 17 years married before they had my brother Emmett, and then 2 years later they had me, and they had to travel to Dublin. My mother travelled in labour to Dublin to have us because...
Actually, I spent a lot of part of my younger life praying for babies in limbo. Then they got rid of limbo. So it was very unfair really after years.
You know. But
well, what about your father's later life then?
Oh yeah, he went funny now. That's all coming back.
I'm taking over from the lads.
Yeah. My father's brother was on the city council as a Labour councillor. I think he got sick from the family now, correct me on that. And my father, he ad hoc my father on for him. So my father was a councillor for, I'm not too sure of how many years, but my mother ran for city council once. She was one of the first ladies to go for it. And her slogan was Biddy Hartree, the housewife, or Biddy Hartree O'Connor, the housewife's choice. She wasn't successful. The housewife's choice. She wasn't successful in that. But the both of them, not only with religion, but with politics. Mother was Fine Gael, and the only reason being that Eddie Collins was a cousin of hers, and father was Labour. And there's been great jokes, great banter in the house, and especially around election time when the city was small then and Ardkeen was miles away, and at those times you could canvass in the grounds of the polling station, and I got the job of having to make the sandwiches for Fine Gael, and Dad would come and sneak in and say, rob a few sandwiches and wrap them up for the lads on the polling stations for the Labour. But Fine Gael knew and Labour knew, and it was happy times. And I think maybe politics was a whole different, more innocent then than what it is now.
But even later years, your father still got involved with Dunstores workers and
yes,
and
in the house with politics. We were never had an outspan orange. Dad was always anti-apartheid. I think when the ban was lifted, we all went out to just taste it outside.
He was one of the first members of the anti-apartheid.
Yes, he was a member of the anti-apartheid unit. And even though my mother wasn't then a lot into politics, she always accompanied him everywhere. He was asked to give a talk on any form of his life. Mum always went with him, and he idolised her. Is the word. I think a cousin of mine says they were like a modern day Romeo and Juliet. That, yeah, they had a beautiful relationship. You know. You think of anything else?
No.
How did your father end up going over? What was like the early years? Was like, how did he end up going over? End up joining up with what he joined up with? How did that?
When he emigrated, because his father and his brothers all were carpenters, but Dad hadn't got that skill, so he went to England with the Power brothers, Johnny Power, and they went to England, and they were working as builders, labourers on the building sites, and they just got involved again in politics over there, and then it came to light what was happening out in Spain. And they decided, yeah, they were going to join the British International Brigade, but
there wasn't enough Irish over to form their own battalion. So they had to team up with someone.
Yeah, they teamed up. They were going to team up with the British, but then the few Irish were saying, "Oh, we can't be with the British," so they went with the Lincoln Brigade. And Dad went out to Spain then because his belief was that fascism had to be stopped. It wasn't about. I think if if fascism had popped up, the first form of fascism popped up in Spain. If it had popped up anywhere, I think they would have gone wherever it had come. But it just happened to have been in Spain. And now, funny enough, now in a recollection there is my father was a teetotaler, and he was one of the only lads in his brigade to get typhoid, because they were all drinking the wine and he was drinking the water. So, but till the day he died, he never drank. He didn't condemn people for drink. He didn't like very heavy drinkers, but he, as Lata said, Mum would have the little bottle of baby sham and was quite content. And I keep saying that the whole time.
You don't, Teena.
What about in later life then? Did things calm down between the church and, I mean, surely that time must have passed for him, that the people were treating, the reception he got when he came back from the war, surely that must have passed out of.
I think as the years went by, people, it's like something horror happens one day and it hits the headlines, and then it goes and it's forgotten. And I think then they just settled down. They settled down into married life. Dad kind of always stayed close to the lads from the International Brigade. When they came home, actually, when they were all home, the 10 men, at the time, they knew from Waterford, 6 of them came home, and they came home on a May Day, and they marched down as far as the ATGW offices in Kaiser Street. And I think that was the start of, people turned out then. People started to realise after the First World War that what fascism could have, if it had been stopped, maybe Germany, Hitler.
Remember the story of your father up at the commemoration for Wolf Tone?
That was after he came home. Yes.
Yeah.
As I said, he was always a strong believer in.
He always thought Wolf Tone was the greatest Irishman
of all times. And he went to the commemoration in Wolf Tone, and of course Wolf Tone was in Bodenstown, and there was a crowd of Protestants. Belfast Protestants came down to commemorate on the same day, and of course there was, what would the word be?
Well, there was a group of Republicans.
A group of Republicans there who tried to push them out of the way, get rid of them. And my father stood up for that, because Wolf Tone was a Protestant, and he felt everybody has a right, whatever a man believes in, or a woman, that's their belief.
Well, Well, they were all working class people together,
Yeah, one
and they
store,
shouldn't have had religion splitting them up, you know. So I think he was kind of still a member of Sinn Féin or something. That's it. But I think he kind of I won't say broken, but
no, that sorry,
that
yeah,
kind
you're
of broke
right.
him up with the IRA and Sinn
That
Féin.
that finished him, Dad, with the IRA was because it was a group of IRA lads, and that finished with him. He just felt that wasn't what the belief should be. If anybody wanted to honour anybody in whatever way, once it was peaceful.
And he felt the
They
same
should
about
be
English working class people.
And
they
the
should
English
have all
working,
been
he would
together
always
against fascism.
would never have condemned the English working class people. He might have now, when he'd be watching the conservatories or something.
The service.
Passed a couple of comments there.
But he wouldn't have been a fan of Margaret Thatcher.
No, he wouldn't have been a fan of Margaret Thatcher, and definitely not Queen Victoria. We would have heard a couple of comments there. But I know. I'm making some mess of this.
So don't make a mess of anything, look.
And in later years, was he still politically active?
Up to the time he died. He
would
was
be still
very
writing letters into
interested.
the Times, even
Yes.
up into his 80s. Yeah.
You know, he felt he wanted when Nelson's pillar was blown up. He was writing letters to the Times that Wolfe Tone or Robert Emmet should have been a statue of Wolfe Tone or Robert Emmet should have been up in the middle of O'Connell Street. The last photograph of my father taken was the week before he died. He was his grandnephew, Councillor Seamus Ryan, was first elected to Waterford City Council. Dad was listening to the radio, the count was on. I can't even remember with their mobile phones then, but somebody ran and they knew at that stage Seamus was going to be elected, and they sent in for Dad, and there was a beautiful photograph with Dad and Seamus. He was so proud that time of Seamus, and still would be always, and Seamus would always be very close to my father. Also, what else did he do in his life? He did loads.
He was very active with the
Very
anti-apartheid
active
group
anti-apartheid
for many
group.
years, yeah.
Very supportive of the miners' strike in the 80s. I think we had miners stayed here. If they came over to do a talk, they'd be put up. Dad and Mam would always be accommodating. She mightn't have, wasn't really after kind of, I think she had us, she wasn't politically minded. Was very, would be reading and well up on things, but she didn't kind of be as forceful as Dad in his gentle way. What else did he do?
I think he never lost the belief in. He's always had the same beliefs that working class people should always stick together.
Yeah.
In the struggle against imperialism, I suppose, and in fascism. But if he saw any injustice anywhere, he always would. He was at that stage. He was probably mainly writing in the papers and that. But there were some commemorations then of the Spanish Civil War were done.
He always attended
fairly regularly. He went back to Spain.
He went,
what year was that?
Could I check that?
The
now?
90s.
Yeah.
Well, it was in the 90s anyway, Teena.
No, he got his citizenship.
Yeah. It was in the 90s.
Oh no, it must be after he wrote this book, because Mam went with him. Mam didn't go.
It would have been in the 90s, didn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it was in the 90s. In 1994, he went with Mam to Spain for an unveiling. But he went out a couple of years later. They were brought out and they were treated like heroes in Spain. Mum wasn't well at the time, so we couldn't go. We had young children. And a good friend of ours, an Englishman, Ken Keeble, who had lived up in the Comers, he accompanied Dad out, and there's a beautiful photograph on the Times of Dad in a wheelchair. It's that he just was very tired that day. It was easier to get him around in the heat, and they came out in Madrid. I don't know whether it was a Parliament House or one of the small Parliament houses, and there was thousands of Spaniards out there, and Dad was overcome. He was always a very emotional man, showed his emotions, would cry if he had to cry, where they say, strong men they do cry. I know that. I'm very passionate now that with the hurling too. We always thought Dad was going to, if he was going to get the heart attack, he suffered all his life this heart, he would get it in the middle of a match, either cheering or get it in the middle of an Ardèche, or he used to follow the Ardèches, and he would also follow the English. I don't know what they'd call those. What would they call those?
Oh, well,
Not
the
the
party,
Ardèches, the political parties, they have their years conference.
Yeah.
He'd be very.
He'd be standing up in the Labour Party.
Well, yeah, he would sing.
He'd sing the song along with them. Yeah.
The red flag.
Yeah, he'd sing that along with them.
Sing the red flag.
Stand up, sing it. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
They actually offer them, didn't they? Offer him Spanish citizenship that time.
They got the Spanish citizenship.
No, because they would have to revoke their Irish ones in order to get it, didn't they?
Well, they got a little kind of.
Yeah.
Honorary one.
An honorary,
yeah. Man wanted to know, do you get the pension? Backdated the Spanish pension.
That never happened again.
They did just a joke over that.
But I think they kind of came from a different time, because I think they kind of came from a time where nobody had anything really. They struggled, and I think all through their life they always wanted to help out somebody else who wasn't a bit of bother. An awful lot different than people nowadays, I suppose.
Yeah.
And they never lost that, so they didn't.
No, and you led it this. With that, I have to say there was a time, and it was a time he went with Mum, and he was retired at the time, and money was scarce, even though it was in the 90s. And I have to say, the glass factory workers, as always, put around a little fund to send them out to Spain. They, I think it was Jimmy Kelly, and God be merciful, that chap, I know that's an awful thing. I can't.
Shemmy Power? No.
No. I can see him, there's a photograph of him on the ATGW. He carved a beautiful piece in memory of the... I can... Hayes,
Tom Hayes.
Tom Hayes. And they knew Dad wanted to go, and they clubbed together. I think
from the union.
Union, and and some of the workers out in the glass factory to get them the money to go.
He gave a talk in later life, and he was in his 80s out in WIT.
He did, yes. He gave it. The
student union
invited him out to give a talk on the Spanish Civil War. His friend Ken Keeble used to write his speeches for him, or else he'd read little excerpts from his book. And he got a standing ovation out there. And he enjoyed the little notoriety. I think he enjoyed that history was kept alive, and it wasn't going to be forgotten of what the Spanish people suffered, and of all the men from Ireland who went, and of the 11 men. And it was after my father died that my brother was doing research, and he found that there was an 11th man who went out from Waterford. I
think he went direct from England.
He went directly from England, but there was no records. I can't recollect now how it came about, but he was added in now. If there's any, if it's always, first it was a 10, now it's always notified that there was an 11th man who went out.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
It's fascinating stuff altogether.